Hello there, everybody. Welcome. Glad to have you join us here on a Sunday afternoon. My name is Viet Nguyen. I'll be the host for your conversation today with Carol Nguyen and Bao Nguyen. You know, we Vietnamese people like to say when we have two wins, that it's a win-win situation. Honestly, I've never been part of a win-win-win situation, but with millions of us wins running around, it's inevitable that that was going to happen. And I'm thrilled that we have this opportunity to bring all this winning power together. That's the last of the win puns. I'm joined today by two really wonderful filmmakers, and I myself am not a filmmaker. I'm a novelist, a critic, but I have written about films, and I think I have some things to say about them. And I was really thrilled to have a chance to watch Carol and Bao's works and have this chance to talk to you about them. Carol Nguyen is a recent graduate of Concordia University in Montreal. And No Crying at the Dinner Table was her thesis film. I hope you got a chance to watch it. It's short, but it's really powerful. I felt myself tearing up watching it, Carol. As we're going to talk about, I think it really captures a lot of the feeling that happens in Vietnamese households, which I think are also really shareable in other kinds of immigrant and so-called ethnic households as well. So we'll talk about how you're able to capture that emotion and maybe what your own personal family life was like. No Crying at the Dinner Table won the Short Doc Jury Award from South by Southwest, which qualifies it for the Oscars. Welcome, Carol.
Thank you for having me.
Our other guest is Bao Nguyen. He is a director and producer who splits his time between Los Angeles and Saigon, which I think is probably as glamorous as it sounds. He produced the recent Vietnamese feature film Rom, which is a very kinetic and energetic account of urban contemporary life in Saigon. It won the top prize at the Busan International Film Festival, and his most recent film is a documentary on Bruce Lee called Be Water for ESPN, which hopefully you too have watched. I love that film. I mean, as a fan of Bruce Lee, as someone who grew up watching Bruce Lee at a formative age of my life, it brought back all the feelings from way back then, and even the little short clips that you showed from his movies really capture the energy and the excitement of what it was like to see those Bruce Lee films for the first time. So welcome, Bao, to this conversation.
Thank you, Viet. I can't think of a better way to spend my Sunday afternoon than to talk with the two wins today.
Well, let's start off by learning a little bit more about the two of you. Why don't you tell the audience how you became filmmakers? And Carol, do you want to start off on this question?
Sure. So I was really lucky that I went to an arts high school that had a film program. So I've been making films since I was 15. I never intended to be a filmmaker. I had always had the vision that I was going to go into business or finance or to do something a little less artistic. But when I made my first film, it released a lot of emotional turmoil that I had held up as a teenager. And I found that I was able to express myself in ways that I couldn't verbalize and ways that I did not yet have an understanding for educationally. And so I fell in love with filmmaking ever since making my first film. And then the rest is history, basically. And as you said, I just graduated from film school. So going into the real world now, and this is a good start, I think.
Well, I think your story resonates with many, especially those of us from immigrant households or Asian households, or the Asian immigrant household, where we're told that by our parents, but by many other people, that we should be business students or law students, medical students, and so on and so forth. So that pressure is real. So, and as I've said often, we need all those people. We need lawyers and doctors and pharmacists and all that kind of great stuff, but we also need our storytellers as well. And so I'm so happy that we have younger filmmakers doing the kind of work that you're doing. So I'm just kind of curious, how did you make your first film? What was it, and what kind of like technology did you use to make that happen?
Yeah, I think I was pretty lucky because the film program that I was in really encouraged personal storytelling. So it wasn't just, filmmaking for the sake of making something fun or a video on YouTube. It was like make something that is personal to you and that matters, and a story that you want to tell. So for the first film, our teacher challenged us to tell something that at that point of our life, being 15, that we thought really impacted us and made us who we were today, that day. And for me, that was a personal trauma that I had when I was in middle school and I couldn't talk about, but it was a grief that weighed very heavily on my shoulders. And that was something that I didn't have the tools to express at home, and I didn't know how to kind of heal from it. So I had bottled up that burden for years, and until that opportunity came where I felt like I had this ability to create something without being able to describe or explain, or put my experience into words and just my feelings into visuals. It was about that. And it was a 1-minute film about a girl trapped in a box and projections just kind of flashing by her eyes. And by the end, she just rips the box open and escapes. Nothing too special, but it was the first stepping stone for me to understand how powerful personal storytelling is, not only to the storyteller themselves, but to the people on the other side of the screen.
No, absolutely. And I think we'll talk about a lot more about that as well once we start talking about your specific movies that people have just watched. But by the way, for the audience, if you have questions, please put them into the chat window. And about halfway through our show, I'll turn to those questions and field them for you to Carol and Bao. So Bao, tell us about how you became a filmmaker.
Oh, well, I think, there's similar trajectory with Carol, and I'm sure, as you said, many immigrant Americans. I never thought I'd be a filmmaker when I was young. I always thought I'd have to be a lawyer or a doctor. I was horrible at science, so I pursued the law path for a long time. But I always had this sort of urge to work in the visual arts. I remember when I was young, I was 5 years old. My parents had me working in their small fabric store, and at the time, this is before iPads and anything to kind of keep a 5-year-old stimulated. And the only thing I had to stimulate myself was the back of these fabric invoices that the customers would give me because I was a cashier. And all day long, I would end up just sketching and drawing on the back of these pieces of paper. So I think I owe a bit of debt to my parents for forcing me to work in their store, because it forced myself to kind of create an imagination and build worlds in a way. So I dabbled in visual arts for a long time, but I never thought I could be a filmmaker for the reasons I mentioned. But also, I think there's this mythology that's created around the idea of like kind of the prodigy filmmaker, that they have to pick up a camera when they're 6, like a Spielberg or some of these very well-known American filmmakers. And my parents weren't into cinema necessarily when I was young, so they didn't take me to the theater as much as I wanted to. But over time, I came to the realization that in order to really honor my parents' journey, the sacrifice they made by coming over to America, should I follow a career path that wasn't necessarily something that I wanted for myself, that I wasn't passionate about? And right before I was supposed to take my LSAT, I remember this memory of my dad. He would come home late from the store, and he would take out this sheet of paper and he would sketch on it. And me and my older sister would huddle around him. And he was drawing architectural designs. And he had told us that when he was younger, before he came over to America, he always dreamt of being an architect. But when he came to America, he had to, work in a job that was more stable, that could provide sustenance to the family. And he gave up on that dream. And that story sort of motivated me to really pursue filmmaking, to kind of go against the grain of maybe what I thought my parents wanted me to do, and really pursue my passion in the visual arts and cinema.
Well, that really resonates because I too took the LSAT, which convinced me I should not become a lawyer. And my father, has always been musical. He's playing the organ at home, for example, and now in his older age taught himself the mandolin. and loves to sing. So in some other life, you know, he could have been a more musically inclined person if he had some of the privileges that some of us have had growing up. And I also worked in my parents' store and had some of that appreciation for what they went through, which also I think motivated me to want to tell stories, because it was, you know, yes, we can pay back our parents by becoming lawyers, for example, but we can also pay back our parents by telling stories about what they've been through. So here's one question for you about, you know, it's great to tell stories that affirm the community that you come from and so on, but what happens if you have to tell a story that you know, airing dirty laundry, for example, stories that people may not want to have told? Have you come across that challenge?
I mean, it's kind of a blessing and a curse that I grew up on the East Coast of America and not in sort of a Vietnamese enclave, because I didn't have sort of the pressures, the outside external pressures of a community telling me the type of stories that I need to tell, especially Vietnamese stories. I think when you have that sort of, I wouldn't say allegiance isn't the right word, but maybe you feel like you have a responsibility to a community. I didn't have a specific responsibility. I felt my responsibility as a storyteller is just tell something that's authentic to myself and what I wanted to say. And I think that's kind of put me in some positions where maybe if I grew up in, say, Orange County or in Houston or places where there is a very predominant Vietnamese American community, then I'd have a more stressful life. And I point to you, Viet, in sort of the choices that you've made in terms of the books that you write. And because one of the lines that I remember you said, and I'm paraphrasing here, it's like, it's not good enough to like offend one person, you should offend everyone. And I as an artist, as a filmmaker, I really take that to heart, because I think you're being just yourself, and not to turn it to, I don't want anyone to start trolling you or anything, but I think that's important to be authentically yourself too. And that's, I think, inspiring for I think young filmmakers who are trying to find their voice and think about the stories that they want to tell. Yeah.
Yeah, I think that theme of telling the story that you want to tell, regardless of what other people have to say, is something that does bind the two movies that you've done, as different as they are. So let's talk about that. You know, again, two very different kinds of movies here. You know, Carol's No Crying at the Dinner Table, I think of it as like a short story. It's very intimate. It's very domestic. It has only one setting, a very few, a small group of people that are involved. Obviously, a very personal movie that comes from the heart. Bow's Be Water is epic. It's about an epic figure, a heroic figure. It's a historical documentary, and you're not in it personally, Bao, but I can feel that it's a very personal film because of the historical continuities between the time that Bruce Lee was living in and what we're dealing with now, and sort of in Bruce Lee's ambitions as an artist and as a filmmaker eventually himself. There must be some kind of personal connection there with you, Bao. But with Carol, with Don't Cry at the Dinner Table, you know, it seems to me that it's a hard story to tell. I mean, I have a very hard time writing autobiographical stories because it's very painful, for example. And then Don't Cry at the Dinner Table is utterly focused on these emotions of your own family. You could have gone wide, you could have gone tight. You obviously chose to go very tight. Why did you make that choice with this particular film?
Sorry, my dad just popped in. I'll just correct you. It's No Crying at the Dinner Table.
I'm sorry, No Crying at Dinner Table.
Sorry, can you just repeat your question?
Yes, you could have gone what, for example, you know, an artist always has to make choices about the scale of the film and the way what their focus is going to be. You chose to go very tight. It's all set around the dinner table, obviously, and it's a very one-on-one exchange with members of your family. Why did you decide to go with this particular way of telling your family story?
Well, I think with a lot of untold stories within the family, it only exists within a small space. And for me, the dinner table was the one space in which we gathered in any given day, where we had the opportunities to talk about these things and connect ourselves and intertwine our lives together, but we didn't. And so when I guess I'll rewind and tell you about how I came upon their stories to begin with, because I didn't set out to make this film. I set out to make a fiction film about a 3-generation family. And so I decided to research my family, and that's where I came upon their stories, which really shocked me because it was the moment where I understood that my trauma from a teenager that I kept to myself wasn't only something that happened to me, something that I had kept for myself, but it was something that every single person in my family held in some sort of way with their own story. And so when I had discovered that, I knew it was a familial story, and I knew I wanted to keep it personal and intimate because this was a change that had to happen from a familial level first, and to address the communication and the love and everything in between at the dinner table before being able to understand what that really was. And it wasn't until I made this film that I discovered what intergenerational trauma was. It took a festival programmer to write the synopsis of, oh, you know, filmmaker addresses her family and talks about intergenerational trauma, that I was like, oh, so that's the feeling that I was trying to get at. That's what I'm trying to address. And I think by making stuff personal, you can address things directly and right to the bone without having to circle around this thing of what you're trying to get at. And I remember pitching this film before I discovered that word, intergenerational trauma. I had circled around mental health, communication, assimilation, 3 generations, and you know that goes around it, but that doesn't exactly say exactly that.
Right. And the intergenerational trauma is a real issue for, again, for a lot of refugees and immigrants and their descendants and so on. So it wasn't a surprise for me to see that happening in in your movie. So, I mean, obviously, part of the power of the interviews that you conduct is that people get very emotional as they're sharing their experiences. Did you anticipate that? And if they had not cried, would there still be a movie?
I think the thing with grief is that I've had conversations with people who ask me, you know, as a documentarian, aren't you scared that when you discovered these stories and when you were preparing and doing pre-interviews with them and already having them tell these stories, that they wouldn't exert the same emotion on screen? But I think the thing with grief, especially when it's the loss of a family member, is that that grief never leaves you, and you'll always carry that emotion with you, no matter how long the time has passed. It's only been now over 10 years that I'm able to talk about my own grief and trauma without crying. And it wasn't my intent that they would cry or, you know, that these emotions would play out similarly to how I had pre-interviewed them. But by them being able to tell these stories at a point where they had already healed themselves, I knew that they would be able to exert emotion, but also in a logical way where they could encapsulate that in a story and in a sitting.
Yeah, and I think it is, you know, it takes a bit of talent to elicit that kind of emotion. I mean, you have to ask the right questions from people. On the issue of questions, audience members, just reminding you, put your questions in the chat window. We'll get to them in about 10 minutes. So Bao, with Be Water in this documentary on Bruce Lee, I'm wondering, was the scale of his legend intimidating in any way when you decided to do this? And of course, I also want to know, like, did you decide to do this, or did someone ask you to do this documentary on Bruce Lee? And did you find it difficult to say something new, given how much people know or think they know about Bruce Lee?
Well, the project came about 5 years ago when my first film was being completed, and I was just kind of thinking about like the next project that I wanted to work on, and different producers were asking me, "Oh, what's sort of your dream project, or like what's an ideal project coming up?" And my first film was about Saturday Night Live, and it's sort of kind of looking at SNL through kind of an anthropological lens and somewhat of a personal lens of how I approached SNL and what it meant to me as a child. And so I'm interested in sort of taking these like grand, iconic American institutions and sort of deconstructing them in a way that feels, a bit more personable to me, and just like a slightly skewed perspective. I think we can kind of revisit our icons or mythologies, American mythologies, through the lens of, let's say, like a immigrant child or a child of refugees, right? And it just gives a little more weight and changes the perspective a bit of things that people are seemingly familiar with. And so Bruce Lee, obviously, is a person, more of a myth, really, when I was researching him. And when you say the name Bruce Lee anywhere in the world, people know the name, but they don't really know the story of the man. And for me, it was really important to kind of deconstruct that idea, that again, mythology, because he was just the man. He was a human being like all of us, like the rest of us, and he went through very similar struggles as sort of an immigrant, right? He was born in America, but he grew up in Hong Kong. But coming over to America, in his late teens with $100 in his pocket, very little connection to the country, I saw the parallels to my parents' journey as well. And I think, as you mentioned, my voice is not in the film. I'm not in the film in any way, but through sort of the perspective, the POV of Bruce Lee, that's how I made the film feel personal. It's just that I can talk about what it felt like, maybe what my parents' journey was like through looking at Bruce Lee's journey and how he had to, quote unquote, assimilate to American culture. And what one of the beautiful things I found about Bruce Lee's story is that he didn't try to assimilate necessarily. He wanted to bring the best of his own culture, of his Hong Kong side, of his Chinese side, to America, and make that part of the American narrative, right? Make that part of the American story. And that was one of the lessons that I learned that, I try to carry with me in terms of the projects that I want to make in the future, and also the way that I look at how I live today, even as a Vietnamese American, right? What that means to be a Vietnamese American as an Asian American.
Well, I think the personal touch for me is evident in how you frame his story. I think a different filmmaker might have focused on the Hollywood side of things and like how he was, friends with Steve McQueen and James Coburn and things like that, which you mentioned. But I think what was really important about his autobiographical narrative coming back to the United States as an American citizen and choosing to live in Seattle and the West Coast was his relationships with other people of color. I mean, you make a big deal out of that, that his assimilation into the his re-assimilation into the United States was done with a lot of interaction, not just with white people, but with African Americans, with Filipinos, with other Asian Americans, for example, and that his story is inextricable from this aspect of the United States as being not just a white country, but a country where people of color, were struggling in the 50s and the 60s for civil rights and equal access, and that was evident in his own struggles with Hollywood not giving him the opportunities that he deserves. So I assume that was a deliberate choice on your part to foreground these elements of his life and career.
Yeah, very much so. I think Bruce Lee has become this global cultural icon, right? He's not seen as an Asian American icon. He's in a way transcended his race. And I wanted to sort of bring that back, right? To see what it meant to be an Asian American male in Hollywood coming to America in the 1960s. Like, what were all the sort of prejudices, types of discrimination that he had to face and struggles that he had to face as an Asian American male? Because I think there's a lot of assumption that Bruce Lee just came to Hollywood and kicked ass and became this huge star. But no, he faced a lot of sort of systemic problems that still need to be faced today.
And on that note, let's talk about some of the systemic problems today. So the most recent controversy involving Asian Americans and Hollywood is about the film Minari, made by Lee Isaac Chung. And I haven't seen it myself, but it's a film that is about a Korean immigrant family in Arkansas. And it's a film that takes place with a lot of Korean dialogue. And the Hollywood Foreign Press Association, which runs the Golden Globes, has nominated it for a picture in the best foreign language film category. And a lot of Asian American artists, filmmakers, actors, and so on were upset with this designation because it implies that Korean is a foreign language, which is not true if you think about how the United States is a country with no official language and with dozens of languages being spoken, and with Korean having been spoken here since the early 1900s with the first Korean immigrants. And it's a very personal issue for Asian Americans, because Lulu Wang's The Farewell got nominated in the same way for foreign language film last year for The Farewell, even though it's arguably a film about Chinese Americans and their interactions with China. And the foreign language categorization has the implication that the people who speak a foreign language are foreign, which raises all kinds of issues for Asian Americans, and it's totally related to what Bruce Lee faced. So, what are your takes on what has happened to Minari? Let's start with you, Carol.
I mean, I think it's very disappointing from a young person and from a person who's from the Gen Z. I feel like this was a big blow to the progress that I thought we were making in the film industry and in society as a whole. And I think when I heard about this, the first question that popped up to my mind is, what does it even mean to be American then? In this global society where our cultures are very multicultural, where was forced migration and still is forced migration, and where we're borrowing and telling stories from other cultures. And like you said in your article, Viet, there are films that have been made in the past, like Babel and like Inglourious Bastards, that feature foreign languages but are still considered American. So what does it really mean to be American, and why do we kind of categorize non-English languages as foreign? I think that is a very dangerous thing to do. I think it's kind of colonialist to do. And when we think of it, like, how did people come to America to begin with? Was this their country? There are a lot of problems that we are not facing when we kind of just state this. We ignore the indigenous peoples, the native peoples. We kind of put the English language and English speaking peoples above other cultures and other languages, which is totally not just. So it outrages me, and I'm not American, but I feel like being from Canada, which is a very large Anglophone speaking country, I can definitely relate. And I've had a situation with No Crying at the Dinner Table as well during our premiere at TIFF, where we kind of were stateless. The film was made in Quebec, which is a Francophone province, but we shot it in Ontario, which is an Anglophone province. And regardless of where the production was from, who the director was, we weren't in the Ontario booth or the Quebec booth. So I did have that stateless moment, and this article just outraged me even more. And yeah, I there's nothing more I can say.
Yeah, I was going to ask you about Canada. Didn't want to forget you were a Canadian, not an American. Hey, Bao, so what's your take on what's happened to Minari?
Well, I had the fortune of seeing Minari at Sundance earlier this year, and it was a film that I felt really reflected like the America that my parents came over to, the America that I knew as a young child. And I think, I mean, Lulu Wang says it's like one of the most American films she's seen this year, and I couldn't agree with her more. And I think it's just like where we place our value of what it means to be American, right? And it's like um, the Godfather series. There's a lot of Italian spoken in that film, and no one would disregard that film as not an American film, right? And I think we even talking about Bruce Lee too. He faced similar struggles where he was seen as foreign, and his accent was seen as too heavy, even though he spoke in a great kind of like British Hong Kong accent that clearly everyone could understand. But I think there are kind of powers that be that want to create this idea of what it means to be foreign and devalue what it really means to be American from a different perspective. And for me, I think when I'm making films and trying to tell these stories, it's um, you know, remembering that our stories have value, right? As Asian Americans, as Asian Canadians as well, any sort of Asian diaspora, that even though we might be kind of newly arrived immigrants, it doesn't change the value that we bring into forming these countries. And um, yeah, for the longest time, I think the you know Asians have always been otherized. The Asian accent still seen as something that's very foreign and not as alluring as, say, the European accent, right? It's not normalized in many ways. And when I'm making films, it's not necessarily to kind of teach the mainstream culture and educate them on my experience, but it's showing like other Asian Americans who are trying to do this in the future, that our stories have value, that they belong on the big screen, that we can create lanes, and that you can see people making stories that reflect your own experiences, and that people are watching them. And in the long run, that's kind of a goal and purpose I see in making these stories that are representational of our experiences. It's not just a token corporate strategy, right? As Angela Davis says about diversity, it's really our existential problem, existential issue that we're trying to not necessarily resolve, but just kind of comprehend and face in our work today.
Right, right. I'm getting questions from the audience now. So if you're in the audience, please make sure to send those questions in. Our first question is for Carol from Luke. Luke asks, with how raw the shots play out, how composed or scripted was filming your family? Was there a lot of pushback from them?
There was no pushback from them, actually. They were very open. And with me being a filmmaker since I was 15 and them helping me with some of my films, they already had a relationship with me as a director and a relationship with the camera. So they were very open to being a part of it. My parents especially were like, why do you want to make a story about us? There's nothing special about this. Sure, I'll tell a story about me not kissing my mom, but like everyone can relate to that in Vietnam, right? So for them, it was nothing special, and it was kind of they didn't understand why they were special as well. So there was no pushback from them. In terms of the film itself, most of the fictional shots, of course, they are composed and framed. The interviews themselves are raw interviews, and we shot what their answers that they had responded. I had gone into this film knowing that I wanted to do a documentary, but with part fiction, because I wanted to kind of illustrate the facade that goes through having to put all these emotions under the carpet, and the years of doing that, and the wondering of the moments where you just see your parents staring into the distance, or like when my dad is praying, like what are they thinking of? What are the stories they're not telling? What is it that I still don't know about them? And by doing so with them all in the house, in a very being in close proximity to each other, I wanted to portray that distance through the walls. And so I put them kind of in their natural habitat. My mom in the kitchen, my dad in the living room, my sister hiding from my parents, smoking. And even today, my parents don't know she smokes. They think it's oregano that we used for the film. So they are fictionalized, but fictionalized in a way that they didn't really have to act much, because they were themselves in those scenes.
I just want to say, given what we just talked about in terms of Minari, the fact that the film is almost wholly in, well, most of it is in Vietnamese. Your sister speaks English. It just continues to affirm, that Vietnamese is one of these many languages that compose both Canada and the United States. And how many decades do people have to live here before they're no longer considered foreign, regardless of the language that they speak? And I think that's one of the implicit claims that simply making a film about people like your parents does, right? Mm-hmm. So next question is for both of you. Carol, how has your film been received in Vietnam? And Bao, how has your film been received in Vietnam and by Asian Americans in general? And I think that can be applied to Carol too, not just the Vietnamese reception, but also Asian Americans or Asian North Americans, Asian Canadians.
You can go first, Val.
Okay. Well, the film hasn't screened in Vietnam yet, in Be Water, but in terms of the Asian American community here, I'm really sort of grateful, and it's been kind of overwhelming, the support that I've received, especially after we had our broadcast in June on ESPN. And it shows that even though Bruce Lee, again, is a very famous figure by name, so many people don't know his story, and just having that humanization of Bruce Lee, where people can feel related to Bruce Lee and his struggles and his fears and his anxieties, it was really important to me, because again, when you think of Bruce Lee, he's sort of like this mythical, like kung fu god in many ways, but to think of him as just a person who was faced the same sort of discrimination as many of us have gone through living in the West. It just creates this idea that we can aspire to be as kind of iconic as someone like Bruce Lee, but also that uh, in our everyday lives we face the same struggles as someone as iconic as Bruce Lee. And yeah, I mean, again, it's been a strange year to be talking about film, but I think people have also shared how it meant to them to talk about an Asian American icon in a year where anti-Asian racism, harassment has increased so much because of the pandemic. And I think that's another reason that it's important that we have sort of um, these narrative heroes that we can look up to, and also these heroes that people from all communities look up to, that happen to be Asian American, right? And it just creates this idea that we are not foreign, that we're all sort of have similar experiences and similar struggles, and that we are American, but by being ourselves, right? By not having to wave a flag or to do all these things that are considered quintessentially American.
Just wanted to follow up with that one. You've had an interesting career because you've made the Be Water documentary, you've made the SNL documentary, you've also gone to Vietnam and made obviously Vietnamese content films as well. You have a new production company that you started that also seeks to enhance this kind of trans-Pacific filmmaking. So you're actually very fluid. You go back and forth. You're not defined purely by doing Vietnamese or Asian American content. Not that there's anything wrong with that, but that you also do this other stuff that is not specific to these communities. Was that a deliberate choice on your part to take on topics like SNL, for example?
I think again, it's a blessing and a curse, right? Of being sort of a living in a trans-Pacific identity, where I can go back and forth between, and have the privilege to go back and forth between Vietnam and America, right? And I think there's so much sort of there's such a relationship between Vietnam and America still, that I'm also sort of navigating and reconciling the narratives between the two countries. And that's why I find it's important to kind of go back and forth. In the same vein that Bruce Lee did, after he was rejected in Hollywood, he went back to Hong Kong and became a star there. And the tragedy is that he never really became a star in Hollywood because he died so young. And I look at that as sort of as inspiration of how with Vietnamese American, Vietnamese stories, that maybe they can have that same sort of stature in cinematic history, and the same way that maybe with Korean American films have been doing lately as well. But I mean, to answer about SNL specifically, again, I think it's everyone has their entry point into Saturday Night Live and these types of institutions, but we've only sort of they've been lensed in a very myopic way through usually an old white male perspective. I think there's so much I use the word diversity here to say that there is needs to be divergence from that perspective into the many different perspectives that have value in watching something like SNL, that show value in watching something about Bruce Lee, right? And how do we sort of reshape these narratives and reshape our value system so it's not based on the traditional ways of how we center success and meritocracy.
Carol, what about your film's reception in Vietnam and or with the Vietnamese and Asian North American communities?
Yeah, the Asian diaspora, well, I had a great response with those who watched it from the Asian diaspora, and also those who were not from the Asian diaspora but were first or second generation. And I think why my film touches that audience base so strongly is because at the core of the film, you know, the only reason why No Crying was able to work the way that it did is because each person told the story in the language that they were comfortable with and that they just listened. And I think when we are first or second generation or are in an immigrant family, there's so much that is lost in translation when we communicate. So many stories that are simplified, that we use half Vietnamese, half English to be able to try to make the other person understand that sometimes it's lost. And I think that because each person in No Crying at the dinner table of my family were able to tell their stories to the full emotion that they wanted to, and the words that they felt at the core that they needed to use, and be able to say it directly without disruption, without needing to clarify, with just feeling, we were able to get through to each other. And I think that's communication is one thing that those in immigrant families struggle with on a daily basis. In Vietnam, the youth of Vietnam reacted to my film very well. I think because the fact with globalization and open borders is that there's cultural exchange, and when there's cultural exchange, you learn about things that you would like to keep in your culture or things that you would like to change. And love and the display of love is one of those things that youth are, what I see, trying to embrace more from the traditional kind of Vietnamese way of loving, where when I left Vietnam last year and I said bye to my 90-something-year-old aunt, and I was like, can I give you a hug? She just stood there stiff. You know, I think we're finding outlets, and we desire different ways to show that affection and to embrace it in a physical way, even through words like I love you.
There's a follow-up question from the audience for Carol. Did your family sit down and watch the film together, and how did they react after seeing it?
My parents watched it together. My sister watched it herself because we got together for this film, actually. I'm based in Montreal, my sister's in Vancouver, and my parents are in Toronto. I'm home for Christmas right now, hence welcome to my childhood bedroom. But they watched it privately on their laptops, and I wanted them to have that private moment before it would go out on a big screen to the audience. But it was in that moment where my parents understood the overarching message of the film, that it wasn't just about my film is about my mom kind of expressing her story, my dad expressing his story, but it's a tie of all three of them together. And they really liked it. They thought it was a good film. And, you know, it's very hard to get approval from your parents when you make work, but that was the best thing that I could hear. And I think when it came out in theaters and we received messages from people from abroad and people who said, I can see my parents in the face of your parents, or, you know, it really touched me because I lost this person recently. They understood how important this film meant for a global community.
Great. Bao, we have a question for you. we rarely see documentaries about Bruce Lee endorsed by the Lee family. How did you get the approval of the Lee family?
Yeah, as you imagine, there's people that are always sort of hounding the Bruce Lee family to make a film, either documentary or scripted, and it really took a long time actually to sort of gain their trust to make the film. Originally, 5 years ago, when I was coming up with the idea, I met with Shannon, Bruce Lee's daughter, and she was just like, "Oh, another Bruce Lee documentary about my father. Like, what's the angle?" And um, she was a bit hesitant at first, and it took a couple years really for them to sign on board with the project. And I think it was sort of my persistence and also the perspective of, of the Asian American experience that convinced them. And after, it was just a year and a half ago where they came on board providing the archive and allowing us to interview them as well. But it should be said that they actually had no editorial control over the film. Shannon watched the film, the final cut, a week before it was broadcast, and so I think it was important just to kind of gain that trust in the first place, where they knew that I was in the right place in terms of the perspective of the story, and also sort of the how the message of the film in a way. But yeah, it was not easy. That's a very hard thing, sort of securing these estate permissions.
Yeah, that was great. Obviously, that you had interview time with Bruce Lee's wife, his brother, his daughter, and then their home footage, which was really amazing, from the kids' childhoods and Bruce Lee working out with his various movie star clients. Question for both of you: which Vietnamese American or Vietnamese Canadian diasporic works might lend inspiration to your upcoming projects?
Hmm. I really admire a Vietnamese cinematographer. His name is Andrew Trung. Um, and I think his eye, coming from the Vietnamese diasporic perspective, really shows the nuances in the Vietnamese culture and the Vietnamese experience in ways that I didn't know before. And I really hope to be able to work with him one day, and I think his work really inspires me. So yeah, shout out to Andrew.
Andrew Trung, Trung.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Wow, how about you?
I mean, I don't want to be a brown noser here, but I think the work, your Carol's film, No Crying at the Dinner Table, was really inspiring. Of just like, how do you look at intergenerational trauma in a unique with a unique lens, and something that's using sort of cinematic language in its truest form. So it makes me think about how I want to tell those same stories with same themes, but using a unique sort of frame. Viet, obviously your books and your op-eds are always very inspiring to me, because they just show a sense of sort of no, I can't think of the word right now, but just a sort of courage and kind of speaking your truth in a way. And so those are you two inspire me, but I think also uh, we kind of stand on the shoulders of giants that came before us, like Stefan Gauger, who sadly passed away a couple years ago. His first film, Alan the Sparrow, was a film that was really formative for me as a filmmaker, because it just showed a modern Saigon in a way I'd never seen it before, with a sort of frenetic energy and the sense of wonder that I recognize when I visit the country, but I don't necessarily recognize it when I'm watching cinematic depictions of it. Obviously, the works of like Ham Chun and Tony Bui are also very inspiring for me. And even the works of like young Vietnamese filmmakers that I've had the fortune of working with when I've been in Vietnam, such as the director of Rom, Dun Dun Quy, and yeah, I mean, I think we've lucked out in our community in a way, just sort of the trauma and the experience of our past history has created a really um, beautiful community of artists. And I hope that we can sort of build, really make it a community, right? Viet, you do it quite well with Divan, and I think if we can expand that to audiences around the world and also connect with not just the diaspora, but also like Vietnamese who are in Vietnam, and finding ways to collaborate and partner on works of art of both through literature and film and music and all the different art forms that are out there.
Right. So you mentioned Ham Chun, who directed Journey from the Fall, which I believe is available on Netflix, which is this epic about the fall of South Vietnam and the refugee experience to the United States. And Ham is, a working director in Vietnam now, doing Vietnamese films. And Tony Bui, who had big success with 3 seasons. Hard to believe I think, is it more than 20 years since 3 seasons?
Over 20 years now, yeah.
Right, yeah, that sort of kicked off, I think, maybe the Vietnamese American film movement, because it achieved such recognition. So people all over the place are working, to build their own particular visions of Vietnamese, American, Canadian diasporic culture and literature and film, and collectively, hopefully, we make some kind of a movement. You referenced Divan. I helped to start that. It's the Diasporic Vietnamese Artist Network. There's a website and so on. There's a blog, Diacritics, where we publish new writers. So it's really crucial to create these kinds of spaces for new voices to emerge, whether it's through writing or whether it's through filmmaking. So perhaps the last question for both of you from the audience: what are you currently working on or planning next? And for Carol, I just want to tack on another part of that question, given that we've also talked about filmmaking in Vietnam and not only in Canada or the United States, is Vietnam at all on your horizon for future work?
Yes, so I'm working on 2 films right now. One is a feature documentary that's in the writing stage, and I'm working on a short animated documentary that takes place in Vietnam. And it's based on kind of the cultural identity crises that a lot of overseas Vietnamese or people living in a diaspora feel when they go back to their motherland. And originally I had taken a camera, a microphone to Vietnam. I knew I wanted to tell the story of this homecoming for the first time and this moment in my life that was very vital to understanding who I became. But it was an interesting experience in Vietnam in the sense that every street that I walked on, it was conflicted to what I had thought the Vietnam that I was going to look like. And I think that didn't exist in the Vietnam itself. It didn't exist in the Vietnam of the past. It was the Vietnam that my parents had told me about, the Vietnam that I kind of twisted and put rose-colored glasses on. And immediately there, I knew that this story could not be told in live action. This kind of imagination of the Vietnam that I was going to and the Vietnam that I was confronted with was very different. So those are the 2 projects that I'm working on, and yeah, very excited for that.
How about you? What's next?
I'm fortunate to be working with the producer that I'm really sort of admired for a long time, and it's a documentary feature sort of exploring the soul of America in a post-Trump, pre-Biden world, and so that's immediately the next project coming up soon. But I'm also working with this great writer, Jeannie Phan Wong, on I won't tell. Viet knows about the project, but we can't talk about too much publicly. But it's a story that I think many people don't know about. That's quite fascinating. I think adds to the narrative of the Vietnamese experience that is quite epic and quite cinematic. And hopefully that we're working on script at the moment. And then I'm actually dabbling in more scripted fiction work as well, and finishing my first fiction script that hopefully we can get shot next year.
All right. On that note of mystery, of course, we can add that working within the Vietnamese and Vietnamese diasporic context, there's lots of fabulous stories out there. epic stories, small stories, just a huge, rich field of potential for our storytellers in filmmaking and in other arts as well. Now, this is the last question. Where can we see both of your films and follow along with the journey of both yourselves and the films?
Well, my film is online for free on Vimeo, so you can just search it up there and watch it whenever. We have social media pages for No Crying at the Dinner Table, so you can follow us there and catch up on our journey throughout the next few months and or a year, who knows?
Be Water, it's on ESPN Plus. If people have ESPN Plus, you can also find it on all the sort of VOD platforms like Google Play or Apple iTunes. Is iTunes still a thing? iTunes and Amazon. So it's available to stream for a small rental fee. And we don't have an Instagram page, but you can follow me on Instagram if you want to check out my future projects. It's Bao, B-A-O-M, Nguyen, N-G-U-Y-E-N.
Carol, Bao, thanks so much for taking time out to talk with me and for sharing your journeys with the entire audience. Good luck with the futures for these movies, but also for everything else that you're doing as well. It was fabulous.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Viet. And I'm looking forward to, you have the sequel to The Sympathizer coming out next year and other
Yes.
exciting projects. So
The Committed out in March 2021 everywhere, I hope.
Can't wait.